Good morning and welcome. I am Paulo Vieira da Cunha, the head of the Chamber's Capital Markets Committee, and it is my pleasure to invite you to this virtual meeting. Those of you who follow Brazil would know that fiscal issues are at the core of macro instability. Inflation may be the current headline, but under it all, it is the fiscal that is of utmost policy concern. This is therefore a most timely meeting. The proposed new fiscal framework is yet to be approved by Congress, and from today's presentations, you will learn what are the issue, the obstacles, and the opportunities.
The new Lula administration has proposed to substitute the spending cap with the so-called new fiscal framework currently making its way through Congress. And we are delighted to have with us a group of true experts on the Brazilian fiscal law and policy to describe the new framework and evaluate the efficacy of the framework in terms of limiting fiscal deficits, the growth in government debt relative to the size of the economy, and the effects on financial markets, inflation, and growth.
I thank you, John. Thank you, Paulo, for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here to discuss this new fiscal framework. Well, I'll try to summarize the main aspects of the rule. The rule is quite complex, and I'll try to summarize its features, problems, and consequences. So let's start with the main features of the rule. We have two main rules, a primary balance target and a spending cap rule. The primary balance target starts with a target of 0% of GDP in 2024, with an interval of 0.25% of GDP below or above the center of the ceiling. And this target gradually increases to 1% of GDP in 2026. For the following years after 2026, targets will be established by the budget guideline law of each year. Each year, we establish the targets for the next 3 years. For the spending cap, the main rule says that expenditure cannot grow above 70% of the real growth of revenue of the previous year. So the idea is that every year, expenditure grows below revenue in order to open space to form primary surplus. Besides, we have another rule for expenditure that says that it cannot grow above inflation more than 2.5% above inflation, and there is a floor of 0.6%. So in real terms, expenditure growth is always between 0.6% and 2.5% above inflation. And there are some other important features. There are many specific features of the rule that I will not present here, but there are two that are very important for my analysis. The first one is that there is a floor for minimal expenditure on health and education. Health and education expenditures, the minimum health and education expenditures have to increase at the same pace of revenue increases. So if revenue goes up by 10%, the minimum expenditure on health and education will have to go up by 10%. There is as well a floor for public investment that cannot be below 0.6% of GDP. The rule says that if necessary to achieve targets of primary balance or to respect the spending cap, this floor for public investment may be cut by 25%. So what are the main problems of this rule? The first one is that we have a bad starting point. Last year, Congress, the government, the elected government, before starting its mandate, proposed and Congress approved a sharp increase in expenditures in 2023, almost a 2% of GDP increase in expenditures. This made the current budget to have a deficit of 2.3% of GDP. This is a bad starting point because we need at least a surplus of 1.5% of GDP in order to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. So going from a deficit of 2.3% to a surplus of 1.5% means a fiscal adjustment of 3.8% of GDP, which is a large fiscal adjustment. The other problem is that more than 90% of total primary expenditures is mandatory, so it's hard to cut. And the new rule created more rigidity in this expenditure when it established, as I said before, a floor for public investment that didn't exist up to now. In fact, the new rule has some mechanisms to limit the growth of mandatory expenses if primary balance targets are not achieved. They are called triggers. These triggers are activated every time primary balance targets are not achieved. But the problem with these triggers is that they are too weak, and there is a lag of up to 2 years in order to then to start working. So they are not strong enough to control the increase of mandatory expenditures. And the other problem is that almost 70% of primary expenditure is indexed to the minimum wage or to public revenue. So every time minimum wage goes up or public revenues, tax revenues goes up, those expenditures have to increase, which put further pressure on spending. It makes it more difficult to comply with the ceiling of increasing expenditures no more than 2.5% above inflation.
Hi, good morning. I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I would also like to greet my fellow speakers. When we look at the evolution of the federal government's public account percent of GDP, we can observe that in terms of revenues, there was growth between 1997 and 2005. This revenue remained relatively stable until 2013, when they began to decrease. The period from 2014 to 2016 corresponds to the economy and fiscal recession that the country had. After the economy recession, the primary revenue of the federal government began to slowly recover. On the expenditure side, there is a tendency for an increase in spend percent of GDP, with stabilization starting in 2016. The new fiscal framework proposed by the executive branches combines several changes to the primary result target with the establishment of a floor and a ceiling for primary expenditure, as well as a floor for public investment. In summary, the primary result target now has a tolerance range, and the real growth of primary expenditure is linked to the real growth of primary revenue. It is worth mentioning that expenditure will have a minimal growth rate of 0.6% and a maximum growth rate of 2.5%. These measures are intended to provide more flexibility while still ensuring a level of fiscal discipline and control over spending. Recent indications suggest that the reform of income taxation will be able to achieve these results and contribute to meeting the primary targets. However, there still remains some degrees of uncertainty regarding the fulfillment of new fiscal framework. For finally, in terms of the trajectory of debt, I would like to present the IFI's baseline scenario for the upcoming years, taking into account the elements of uncertainty. The stochastic scenarios for public debt indicated 42% probability to gross debt reaching 90% of GDP by 2027. Indeed, in this, it is a challenging scenario that highlights the importance to maintain fiscal discipline and implement effective debt management strategies. It also underscores the need for continuous monitoring and proactive measures to ensure the sustainability of public debt in the face of uncertainties and potential risks.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'll talk a little bit about this new fiscal strategy and what we see in the coming years for Brazil. But let me start by saying that the markets in Brazil improved a lot after the new fiscal framework was published by the end of March. Have in mind that you're talking about a country that from 1997 to 2015, the real growth of the non-financial central government expenditure were more or less 6% per year. And although this new fiscal framework will not do the job, as Marcos mainly said, and Vilma as well, that it will not be able to stabilize the public debt to GDP by the end of this government, I think it's fair to say that at least it improved the fiscal scenario, because at the beginning of the year, everybody was expecting that the debt to GDP in Brazil would grow in the next 2 years by more or less 8 percentage points of GDP. It would go up from 73% of GDP last year to something around 81% of GDP by the end of next year, by the end of 2024. And now with this fiscal plan, our numbers changed. We expect that the gross debt to GDP for this year and next in Brazil will go up from 73 last year, 2022, to something around 77 to 78% of GDP. Instead of growing 8 percentage points of GDP in 2 years, the debt to GDP in Brazil will grow around 4 or 5 percentage points of GDP in 2 years. It's not good, but it's much less than what we were expecting 6 months ago. In addition to that, at the beginning of the year, everybody was expecting that the GDP growth in Brazil this year would be something around 0.9, and next year, something about 0.7. Now, because of this, all-time high agricultural production, the market is expecting a Brazilian GDP growth this year around 2%, a little bit higher than 2%. And this will improve a lot, the debt to GDP. In addition to that, finally, the inflation expectation for Brazil is coming down. We need to remember that by the end of January, in the beginning of February, we heard the government criticizing, the inflation target, that the inflation target at 3% to Brazil probably was too low. And there was this fear among, many economists in Brazil that the government would eventually raise the inflation target to 4% or even 4.5%. Fortunately, this didn't happen. 1 month ago, by the end of June, the government decided that the inflation target in Brazil will continue to be 3% until the end of this government. And this was good news for, for the market. Everybody cut the inflation expectation for the coming years. And because of that, the yield curve in Brazil went down sharply. We're talking about, cut in the yield curve in Brazil more or less by 300 basis points in the last 3 months, which is a lot. So, based on the fact that you have higher growth, that we have low interest rate, this scenario for the debt to GDP improved. Although we don't see the debt to GDP stabilizing in this government, because at this moment, we don't see how the government will be able to raise revenue to meet the fiscal targets. 1 week ago, the Minister of Finance, Fernando Haddad, gave an interview, and he said that in August, the government will need to send the budget proposal for the next year in August for the Congress. And the minister said that he'll send, together with the budget proposal, a new tax reform tax reform that will deal with income tax, because he needs, some extra revenue in order, to meet the target that he put in place for next year. I mean, having said that, the benefit is that although nobody in the private sector expects that the government will meet the fiscal target, things got better. It was able to cut what we call the tail risk. We won't have an explosive growth of the debt to GDP. We won't have, non-financial central government expenditure increase by 6 or 7% real terms per year, as it happened from 1997 to 2015. And nowadays in Brazil, to tell you the truth, it's much more difficult, to start new programs to increase subsidies. If you go back to Brazil 10 years ago, if some government decides, I wanted to increase subsidy, I wanted to increase loans from the public banks, from BNDES, the government could easily, issue 100 billion reais, of new debt and send the money to BNDES to start lending, charging subsidized interest rates. Today is much, much more difficult. First of all, it's not possible anymore for the treasurer to issue bonds, public bonds, and send to BNDES, because, this is illegal. 10 years ago, it was not clear whether or not it was illegal. So today, the government has, let's say, a hard time to find ways to increase public expenditure and to increase subsidies, to adopt, to put in place industrial policies, sectorial policies, etc. So at the end, let me put it this way: you still have a long way to go. It's very difficult to see how the government will be able to increase the revenue by 2 percentage points of GDP. And because of that, the consensus of the market is that the debt to GDP will continue to grow for the next 3 years. 3 years from now, in the next presidential election in Brazil that will be held in 2026, we will be debating what will be the new fiscal plan. Unfortunately, that's the reality. But the good news is that, okay, although you'll not be able to stabilize the debt to GDP, at least, the debt to GDP will not grow to, let's say, 86% of GDP or 90% of GDP by 2026.
Well, John, thank you. Paulo, Marcos, pleasure. Vilma, pleasure. Welcome to Brazil. I hope you will enjoy your stay and your time at the Senate. Clearly, and historically, all the fiscal debate in Brazil was pushed by crisis. That's happened in 98, 99, when we created the fiscal responsibility law, 2002, 2003, when Lula won the first term as the president, and 2015, 2016, with the tragedy of the Dilma Rousseff's administration, fiscal administration, and recently the pandemic that were also creating conditions to put back the fiscal rules and the fiscal issue on the agenda. The common point was the crisis, always. So what pushed Brazil to do things is crisis. Brazil is a country moved by crisis. We do not do things without being stimulated by crisis. And that's not different today. The difference today, because never the circumstances repeat in the same manner, is the fact that we have a different framework, a political framework, which is very important, a new administration, and the hunger for spending. So the hunger for spending from the new administration and from the Congress. And as you know, the Congress, since 2015, 2016, became much more influential over the budget execution. It's clear for me, after Mansueto and Marcos and Vilma, the fact that we need to increase revenues to comply with the rules and to keep a minimum fiscal balance ahead. And this will be a challenge because, as I said, the institutional framework of Brazil today is very complex. The political establishment of Brazil is very complex. Just a footnote, the recent tax reform are raising a lot of questioning in the Senate, from organized sectors like the agribusiness, the cities, the mayors of the cities, the services sector. So these people are going to mobilize them, trying to impose modifications in the tax reform. So to cut spending and or to increase revenues, to increase tax collection will be a challenge, a big challenge for the government, especially because there's contradictions in the political management of the government. There's a friendly fire inside the government, and there's a friendly fire or enemy fire between the administration and the Congress. And this will be more critical because we are approaching the next year election, municipal election, that will put a lot of allies of the government in the federal level fighting in the municipal level. So I do not see an easy life for the government if the agenda becomes really, really complex about the fiscal debate.
And I think the presentations come to the same conclusion. Primary goals were a little bit ambitious. The government is betting on revenue that are still uncertain to match the targets. That sustainability depends on complying with primary targets. At the IFI, our projections for inflation for the next year, for example, is 3.9%. It's above the inflation target. This scenario is compatible with the interest rate of 9.5% and economic growth of 1.2%. In terms of in long terms, we have for economic growth projection for around 2% of economic growth in long terms. And in conclusion, I think the scenario is very complex, and we need depends on the increase the revenue, and the government is betting on the revenue, and I think it's in the income taxation reform.
Okay, I mean, let me stress that if you go back to Brazil since 1995, when you adopted the real plan, the average inflation rate in Brazil in every single presidential mandate was never lower than 5%. You know, according with the market numbers, we might, you know, even if we stay above the inflation target in Brazil is 3%. Suppose that you know that you never reach 3%, that you have inflation next year around 3.8%, and then next year around 3.5%. You know, you have in this government the lowest average inflation for 4-year mandate since 1995. So I mean, let's have in mind that you know, Brazil never had average inflation around 3.5 or even 4%. The lowest one was 5% in a 4-year mandate. So the numbers of inflation in Brazil is going down, and this will help us to cut the interest rate. As Vilma said, we can reach a terminal interest rate of 9.5 or even lower than that. If this happens, it will, you know, it will help a lot to control the growth of the debt to GDP. So I think everybody agrees here that we still be debating fiscal effort, fiscal adjustment 3 years from now. But the point is that we're not going through, let's say, unsustainable growth of the debt to GDP in the next 3 or 4 years. I agree with Marcos that, you know, we cannot bet that Brazil will grow for the next 10 years, around 2 or 2.5% per year. We're far away from that. But, you know, in the short term, what will be key to have a higher growth next year is not productivity, it's interest rate. Today, Brazil is running probably the highest real interest rate in the world. The short-term interest rate in Brazil, the Selic, is 13.75%. The expected inflation for this year is around 4.8%, and next year is 3.8 or 4%. You know, a nominal interest rate of 13.75% with the current expected inflation. It seems to me that it's very, very high. We're not, you know, nobody is defending that central bank would, you know, go in a rush to cut the interest rate, but I think we have some space to start doing that in August as the market expects.
It was my pleasure to have you all. Thank you very much. We'll have to do something on the fiscal reform or tax reform, right, Paulo? And I want to thank you all for joining us. I know it's been a long one. Thank you to all the panelists, Marcos, Vilma, Mansueto, and Murilo. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone.